Never spend your money before you've earned it. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. We meet you once again at 9:35 p.m. live on TV1. It's always a pleasure to be moderating this show. As always, tonight our topic of discussion revolves around the country's economy. 2020, we started off the year without a budget, minus the most important component in the country's economy, thanks to presidential election last year. And then they thought that a budget would be presented after the general election due in April. Thanks to COVID-19, the general election too was postponed, and then we had an election in August this year. Now there is a new government, there is a two-thirds majority. What will happen next as far as the country's economy is concerned? To discuss all this and more, we've invited four guests to our studios this evening as well. Joining us tonight on the show is Daniel Alfonsus, former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Nice to have you on board, Daniel. Also joining us tonight on the show is Dr. Priyanka Dunasinghe, senior lecturer of economics, University of Colombo. Also joining us tonight on the show is Dr. Sarat Rajapatrina, chair, academic program, Advocata Institute, and also Kit Minhevage, research economist, Institute of Policy Studies. Nice to have the four gentlemen on the show tonight. Let's start off tonight's show with Dr. Priyanka Dunasinghe, senior lecturer of economics, University of Colombo. Dr. Priyanka, interestingly, we started off the year without a budget. Now it's 9 months and we've just entered the 10th month of the year. And we've done quite well without a budget, haven't we? Do we really need a budget for the year 2021? The time starts now.
Yes, I think budget serve for few purposes. In addition to presenting the expected government expenditure and also the revenues, plus whatever the borrowing that government expect to do, I think most important part of the budget is to present a clear-cut economic policy for the country. That is the most important part. So when you present a budget, it is very important to highlight the policy direction of the government to the general public, as well as in particular for the investors, local and foreign investors. Now what happens when you don't have a budget, in particular when a new government come into power, investors do not get a clear direction, concrete policy position. So that could have a negative impact with respect to investment or the business climate, and in particular for when it comes to improving business confidence, that could have a negative impact. And also in certain situation, you may need to enact some of the bill. So government could do such enactment or introducing bills and necessary amendments only when you present a budget. So when you don't have a budget, we cannot say that it is a good policy decision or the good decision of a government. Always you need to present a budget and make it clear for the investors and general public about the economic policy of the government. So we tend to look at the budget as just presenting it's a government revenue and expenditure, but it is not all that, I think.
Dr. Priyanka, just before COVID-19, the first wave of attack took place in Sri Lanka, we had four economists on this very show, and we discussed about the country's economy. And one of the economists said at the show that we are in a very dangerous situation in terms of the country's economy. Do you think that we are still heading towards that dangerous state of affairs as far as the country's economy is concerned? Where are we really settled right now as far as the country's economy is concerned?
I think it is very clear even starting from somewhere in 2014, economy is heading towards what we call sort of a crisis, in the sense we face several challenges, in particular with respect to government finance, where even though the previous government took some measures in terms of improving revenue position of the government, what we have experienced over the years, we heavily depend on borrowing. And as a result of that, at the moment our debt position, in particular foreign debt levels are very high. So we have to, even in this year, we have to repay around $4 billion. So partly because of that, you may have heard about that some credit agencies have downgraded Sri Lanka. On the other hand, export performance are not really up to the expectation. So there are a number of issues actually the economy faced. I don't say that it just started in this year or the last year, but certainly during last 6 to 7 years, we could see due to mismanagement, some of the mismanagement, we have got into this situation. So even though things look very good when you just look at it from from out, really if you dig into the economic the issues and also dig into the statistics, you could see clearly there are a number of problems right now the economy faces.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priyanka Dunasinghe, a senior lecturer of economics, University of Colombo. We now move our attention to Dr. Sarath Rajapatirana, Chair, Academic Program, Advocata Institute. Nice to have you on board, Dr. Rajapatirana. Starting off, Dr. Priyanka spoke about credit agencies downgrading Sri Lanka. One of the latest developments on this is Moody's downgrading Sri Lanka to CAA1 from B2. What does this really mean for the country's economy? Is this something to be alarmed?
I don't like to use the word alarm. I'll say it's a concern in the sense that they had downgraded us two steps, from BT to CAA1. Basically, what these rating houses do is they publicize what they think is our ability basically our creditworthiness with respect to the rest of the world and with respect to our other investors, both local and foreign. So in a way it is their job. There are three rating entities, generally they agree. Now some people criticize this, but actually, as Dr. Priyanka says, if you go back to 6-7 years ago, we see this coming in a way, because the numbers could not lead to a resolution because we couldn't raise the revenue adequate, although there was an increase. We were only able to get to the expenditure by a very strict cutting down of imports, and so I think it is one for concern how we are going to go forward. Especially important for a new government, because their standard has not been still set yet. So when a new government comes into being, we want to say, as Professor Priyanka said, Dr. Priyanka said, what are their plans? What can, if I were an investor, what should I be ready with? Am I going to continue to do the same thing, or am I going to look at what the government is going to do? Some idea of reassurance, things are going to be this way rather than other way. So I think that's pretty important. And when you come to your point, I have no quarrel with the downgrading. If we were independently, if we say we are looking at a country X have the same situation, I say yes, we will have to say we have not been able to really get to a situation where our creditworthiness have been improved. So it is natural that they did it. Sometimes they get enthusiastic and do something more, but I think what was difficult was the two-step reduction in our creditworthiness.
Dr. Rajapatran, do you think that Moody downgrading Sri Lanka was premature?
No, I don't think it's premature. It becomes premature in the sense that because we paid the 1 billion very easily because it was prepared and ready to pay it. But there, Moody is not looking for the next year. Moody has to look for, if you are really evaluating creditworthiness, you have to see at least in the 5-year horizon where you are going to be.
You said that you don't have any quarrel with Moody's. However, the minister in charge, the state minister in charge, Dr. Ajit Niwar Cabral, says we have sufficient reserves to meet our debt obligations without default. There will be no interruptions whatsoever. So this means that the government is quite ready and geared up to face the future, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think we can have a difference of opinion in the sense that just because we were able to meet this debt payment that was due on October 4th, because they were prepared for it and they were ready to do it. The central bank have been preparing for it from the time of the earlier governor. But what I'm worried is how about the next year and the year after that.
So are you trying to say, Dr. Rajapatran, that the 4th October debt repayment came as there was good management by the previous government as far as the country's economy is concerned?
I'm not referring to the government, I'm referring to the government at central bank. But the central bank was prepared for this. But I'm not so sure how we are going to marshal the next step. Because actually 21 is we are going to have a bit of bunching of repayments coming out in 21, which was not here in 2020. They have a small amount like $436 million for coupon payment, but that's relatively small amount, but it will be added to the 21st budget.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarath Rajapatran, Chair, Academic Program, Advocata Institute. We now move our attention to Kitmina Hevage, Research Economist, Institute of Policy Studies. Kitmina, one of the most overused words in business is strategy. And one of the most overused words when it comes to economists is resilience. When it comes to the Sri Lanka's economy, economists predicted that Sri Lanka's economy would crash within a period of 12 months. However, when we have gone through that process and now we are in 2020, now the economists are saying that Sri Lanka is a very resilient nation and henceforth we can encounter any problem that comes our way. What is your take on the country's economy?
Well, let me start by saying that I don't speak for all economists in Sri Lanka. So there are enough economists on this panel. I think we need to look at two things. One is that when we talk about debt, we're talking about a story that started from independence itself, because successive Sri Lankan governments, and this goes on to both main parties that existed at the time, have based their development strategies on debt-led development. So the Mahavari development scheme is the best example of that. The difference is that in 2010 we graduated to middle income status, which meant that we no longer qualified for concessional loans, and therefore we had to go to international sovereign bonds and international capital markets, which goes from paying interest at 0%, 0.01%, to going to paying at 3, 4 and 5% on loans, which is why we have this debt accumulation over the next 3 years. So that is why I think over the past, as the two speakers before said, over the past 7 or 8 years, economists have predicted that there is this bunching up of debt between 2020 and 2023 that is going to challenge the Sri Lankan economy, and for that we needed to build up enough reserves and so on. So over the next 3 years, two challenges. One is in regards to the debt payment issue. At the same time, we are also dealing with the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the domestic economy. So in that regard, I think the fact that we have relatively performed well in managing the health crisis and the domestic economy has kick-started quite early compared to other countries, I think that is a positive sign. the fact that the domestic economy was functioning. Of course, the news yesterday and today is concerning. This might, affect us negatively. So on the domestic economic side, there are positive signs that the economy can look towards.
Let me interrupt you for a second here, because you are speaking about COVID-19. I want to drag your attention to the second wave as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. We just heard of news about the second victim being identified yesterday from Deulapitia, and hence a curfew has now been imposed in 3 areas, 3 police divisions at present. And the news that we are getting right now is that police leave has already been cancelled for all police officers in the country. Can we afford to go through another lockdown in the country?
It's going to be detrimental to the economy. Another lockdown is undoubtedly going to be detrimental, as we saw during the March to June sort of time period. However, when we talk about the current pandemic, public health concerns have to trump first. And if we don't deal with the public health aspect of this pandemic, the economy is going to be affected as well. And we've seen that in countries across the world where they've tried to prioritize the economy over the public health response, and they've failed. They failed on the public health aspect as well as the economic aspect. So depending on the situation, I think we need to assess as to how far community spread has taken place, and whether we can, for example, manage it by geo-specific lockdown. So can we manage it by locking down certain parts of the country while the rest of the country can operate?
Where do you see the role of the private sector with regard to fighting COVID-19 is concerned?
2 things. I think in terms of economic activity, the private sector now has to move towards alternative means of economic activity. So for example, more emphasis on e-commerce, more emphasis on digital economic activities and so on. So that is one thing. The second thing is, can the private sector move away from structures that they have been working on for the past few decades? So I think some aspects of the economy have been based on protectionist measures, and therefore they haven't necessarily elevated their competitiveness levels in the economy. That is going to impact us in the long run, particularly when we kind of revert back to the debt issue, because we need to improve our export earnings.
Thank you very much, Kitpin Hevage, research economist, Institute of Policy Studies. We now move to Daniel Alfonsus, former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. Daniel, in your opinion, is the government giving out the right signals to foreign direct investors to come and invest in Sri Lanka at a time there is a new government, there's a new president, there's a 2/3 majority in parliament? Are they giving out the right signals? Is it amber, green or red?
So let's first look at some of the positive signals that have taken place. From an investor's point of view, there's been some tax concessions that have meant that Sri Lanka is more competitive as a destination for investors. There have been some industrial zones that are being built. There's some energy in the Board of Investment and the EDB. So that's all on the positive side. But if we look at the negative side of the balance, as it were, I think there's some concerns.
Like what?
The first concern, I think, is with respect to macroeconomic management. Everyone's talking about default, about debt. So there's some serious concerns about the government's ability to recognize the current precarious situation that Sri Lanka is in, and to take the serious measures that may be required, which I'm sure we'll discuss later during the show. That's one. And then secondly, there's the governance aspect of things. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We are in a very serious economic situation at the moment, and it seems that the government has its priorities elsewhere. So I think the markets seem a bit concerned about all these issues.
When you say the government's priority is somewhere else, what do you mean by that?
So I'm referring to the recent constitutional amendment process that's going underway.
So do you think that the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, if it's implemented in full as it is right now, that FDIs won't come into the country as expected?
I think it could have some impacts on FDI in 2 particular ways. First, if you look at portfolio investment, that's investment in government securities and so on. That depends on investors being able to correctly assess the repayment capacity of the government. Without an independent audit service that's able to audit all branches of the government, it may be difficult for investors to understand the true picture, and that includes SOEs as well. Secondly, on the FDI side, having an independent judiciary is absolutely vital for investors to have confidence that their contracts will be respected, including with the government of Sri Lanka.
Foreign exchange reserves, how serious is this right now for Sri Lanka? Is it a matter of priority that the government should start focusing on right now?
So the question to ask is, why do we need foreign exchange reserves? Foreign exchange reserves exist primarily to stabilize any unexpected fluctuations in the currency. So I think the concern at the moment is that we're using our foreign exchange reserves to settle debt, which leads to the question that this show is really about: what's going to happen afterwards?
So the government is on the right direction. They have put on import restrictions. Oil prices, which have been reduced globally, is also impacting this country's economy. So the government is on the right track, aren't they? Because we know that they're also looking at moving towards a swap agreement with India, which would boost the country's economy. That is approximately $1 billion US, and then Sri Lanka will also receive 700 million as the second tranche of the 1.2 billion syndicated loan from China Development Bank. We have already received the $500 million mark this March as well. So we are on the right track, aren't we?
On the right track to what?
In terms of boosting the country's exchange reserves.
Yes, we may be boosting our country's exchange reserves in the short run, but in the long run, the question is, will we be able to repay all the debt payments that we have to make over the coming couple of years? There, the answer is far from clear. Global markets seem to take a rather dim view of this. The yield on Sri Lankan government debt, that's a measure of risk compared to other emerging markets or US treasuries, has increased substantially. It's now in the double digits. No country has a larger risk premium for its sovereign debt. There's 3 countries only in the emerging markets that have a higher risk premium than Sri Lanka. That's Angola, Zambia, and Lebanon.
Daniel, very quickly, Moody downgrading countries. You saw this happening in India as well, but India did not take seriously what Moody said. So do you think that Sri Lanka also should take seriously what the Moody's reaction towards Sri Lanka's debt repayment is concerned?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily just Moody's. It's Moody's, it's the international markets, it's conversations that are happening in policy-making circles domestically, in academic circles domestically. Everyone is expressing a great deal of concern on this issue at the moment. So I think it's something that needs to be thought through soberly and with great care.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So we open the floor for questions from our journalist. On to my immediate right is Nadim Majid, as always. On to my immediate left is Zeenat Musafir and also Jama Ratnayaka. Let's start off with the lady tonight. So Zeenat, it's all yours. We'll start off from you.
I would like to ask Ms. Dr. Rajapathiran the first question. Doctor, debt sustainability is a topic that has been discussed for several years. We all know the importance of debt sustainability. So some are of the opinion that we need to focus more on the cost of debt rather than the quantity of debt. And then some say that we need to focus more on restructuring our debt stock, focus more on giving more space for concessional loans. And then you have some questioning the concessionality of concessional loans. So given the prevailing economic conditions in Sri Lanka and in the world, what sort of an approach do you think Sri Lanka should take to address debt sustainability, to manage our debt better?
You know, you cannot really isolate, distinguish or separate cost from the availability. They are linked. There's a demand curve and supply curve for debt. Question is that, and I think you are going to this group anyway to this answer, in the sense that it is not the debt that is the problem as much as what we are going to do with the money that we have raised. So we are in this particular predicament today because the way what we borrowed and how we used it. Obviously we had to have a rate of return like any investment, But if it involves foreign debt, the rate of return must be incredible goods, so you can convert that into repay. Okay? So there is nothing wrong about borrowing, by the way. The biggest countries in the world, United States, borrowed from small Holland in the 18th century, So everybody had borrowed one another. But the terms were in the sense that they did some good things with it and they could build it up, build up the economy, the infrastructure, the institutions, and that is the story of most of the countries in Europe as well as in developing countries that have succeeded, right? Many of the countries in East Asia, for example, borrowed with possible exception of Korea. Others borrowed a lot, Taiwan, for example. So I have no quarrel with the borrowing. I'm saying, given our current situation, are we borrowing to repay debt? So that is what Keynes called widow's cruse, that is never-ending program system. So we have to be careful there. Concessionally, I don't think we are eligible any longer for concessional loans. We used to have very good concession loans when our per capita income was below the threshold, but after it declared as middle income into now 4003, which are now adjusted for the decline in output due to COVID, is something like 3,900, something in that order. So I think the chance of getting concessional assistance is not very high for us, to be frank. There are other countries that are much more deserving, in the sense much poorer than us. And the other thing is that the IMF facilities that we can take, they have a new facility for emergency payments. They had separated out $31 billion in order to meet those requests. Already 76 countries have gone to it. Our application is still under consideration. I think there we might be able to get that availability and better terms from the International Monetary Fund.
So, Rajapatran, do you think that Sri Lanka is in a position where we need to avail ourselves of an IMF, essentially a bailout?
Well, my friend, they have bailed us up 16 times. So,
do we need another one, is what I'm asking?
No, I think it will
Are we
make
in a
it easy.
position right now where
no,
we need
the choice is this. Is the option. The choice is that why do we have to borrow, because we have to maintain our level of consumption. So we have a choice. Are we going to borrow some money and avoid the issue that we have to cut down consumption, keep on paying debt and meeting our old obligations? In a way, I believe it's not the money from the IMF that is more important than the discipline it imposes on us.
Dr. Rajapatran, just for the clarity of our viewers, when you say cut down on consumption, what specifically are you referring to?
No, we have a larger part of our national income is consumption, right? So if we don't have enough output, enough value of output, then consumption is affected. If you grow by 2% as against 4%, then it affects our consumption. So in a way, it's a consumption smoothing that is the rationale for debt. I think we should avail ourselves. My opinion is that most people would agree with me here that in this particular circumstance, this unusual situation, we have COVID-19, we have a big debt hangover that we have to meet with, and beside all that, we have to be growing. We cannot be, can't afford to ignore the growth part of it. This must go in two tracks at least. COVID, there's a natural end to COVID. Actually, if people follow the rules, there will be a natural end. Like every life has a limit. But that other two things about getting economic development going and be able to paying our debt, those are the immediate issues that we are facing. COVID is handled by people who are competent, who do these things. They have done first round very well. So I don't so much worry about COVID, but I worry about what we will do in the process of paying the debt. If we do things like, for example, I don't think it's very good to ban your imports at a top of a hat, but there are consequences. most economists know that a tariff on import is a tax on exports.
Thank you, Dr. Rajapatran. Daniel, next question for you. In August, the government already passed a vote on account for 1.3 trillion rupees until the next budget is sort of tabled. Let's say 17th of November, I think the budget is going to be tabled. So having already adopted or passed a vote on account for 1.3 trillion rupees, there is a expectation amongst the public that with the upcoming budget for 2021 as well, that there will be handouts because people are suffering and there is a need for public welfare to be looked into. When you look at the potential, possibly even inevitable conditions that will accompany a IMF facility, whether it's an extended fund facility or this new emergency payment facility that Dr. Rajapatran was referring to, are you concerned about the government's ability do you feel that the government's ability to deliver on welfare will be compromised?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the great tragedies of having borrowed in good times and spent that poorly. It means we don't have the fiscal space required to provide public welfare and a stimulus in this very difficult period in our country's history, economically speaking. So yes, the government's ability to provide a fiscal stimulus is very limited. As to your question on the IMF, in relation to that, yes, I think if the government does go for an IMF program, a significant part of that program is going to be measures that seek to reduce the stock of debt. In other words, measures that seek to increase revenue and decrease expenditure. And that's what you've seen in the last couple of IMF programs that Sri Lanka has had. But one thing I'd just like to quickly add is often with the IMF programs, they've tried to address the issue of growth as well, the structural reforms that Sri Lanka has been putting off for over a decade now. Because if you look at the period 78 to 2004, governments, whether they were SLFP or UNP, pushed through some reforms. Since 2004, you've basically seen a stagnation in terms of productivity reforms. So I think what will be important is to have a conversation as a country as to what kind of IMF program we want and to really make sure that the negotiation includes a significant growth component, not only a fiscal consolidation component.
Daniel, there's no point crying over spilt milk, but you said that since 2004 there's pretty much been a stagnation in implementing reforms. Is this true also for the period between 2015 and 2019?
In terms of productivity enhancing reforms, there were some reforms, but as a whole there was nothing like what happened between 78 and 2004.
Dr. Dunasinghe, in the event that we go for an IMF, same question actually that I posed to Daniel, do you envision that the government's ability to provide for the welfare of the people that really need it in the country right now, that the government's ability to provide will be severely compromised?
Yes, I think even if you look back, the time that in which that government approached the IMF for IMF facilities, it is very clear that government had to take some of the steps to increase revenue, cut down expenditures, and so I think same thing will repeat. In particular, when IMF extend a facility, it says that it wants to address some structural weaknesses in the economy. Structural weaknesses in the sense of so for example, if you have say difficulties in terms of debt payment arise mainly because your revenue is not sufficient and your expenditure is high. So if you do not raise revenue and cut down expenditure, there is no way.
Dr. Dunasinghe, one of the main components or one of the main issues that the IMF has always brought to the table as far as Sri Lanka is concerned is to have a proper extensive tax regime in the country. However, last year we saw when the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration was elected to power, they withdrew some of the taxes and went through the old format of not having a proper structured tax regime in the country. Will this also affect Sri Lanka in the long run?
Yes, definitely. Actually, if I summarize it, IMF is very much keen right now in the sense in recent years on the fiscal rule, binding fiscal rules. We have the Fiscal Responsibility Act where that you have to get the approval for the say debt limit and the budget deficit levels and all these things, but those are not binding. So as a result of that, they justify on various ground and extend the debt ceiling and then allow for higher budget deficit, so that IMF is very much keen on introducing certain fiscal rules and make it binding.
But why is that the government is going against that rule? Because Dr. Rajapatran said that 16 times the IMF has bailed out Sri Lanka. So this probably is the 17th time that the IMF would come to Sri Lanka's rescue. In that event, why not stick to the principles that has been put forward by IMF? Why is the government going against that notion or principle?
Well, I think there may be some reasonable grounds as well.
No, because you said that a budget is supposed to bring in the policy direction of the government. Do you think that this government would bring that policy direction to the people of the country as far as the country's economy is concerned?
It is very difficult to say due to political economy reasons. Any governments, even the previous government, though IMF drafted this fiscal rule bill, actually what happens once you introduce, then you have limited capacity to respond in certain situations.
Are you trying to say that the Rajapaksa regime is trying to put the country's economy in limbo?
I don't think so. But I think when it comes to managing the economy in certain context, that you may have to go beyond certain rules, beyond in the sense, for example, shall we say we set the fiscal rule, what happened now, it is binding, so it will be difficult for the government to respond to a certain situation.
Kitpina, now interestingly what Dr. Priyanka says, the government is not trying to put the country's economy in limbo. However, there is a problem. The problem is we have $4.2 billion as foreign debt service forecast at present, and we have already paid $1 billion. The next 2.5 months is going to be extremely crucial because we have to pay $3.2 billion in debt forecasting. Where are we going to find the money? Is the government going to create some magic, pull something out of a hat? What's going to happen?
Well, right now our foreign debt is in total over the next 4 years, I think right now is 35.4 billion in total. And our foreign reserves are $7.6 billion.
In the red?
Our reserves are 7.6. So
in the red, because we don't have that much of money to pay out.
Yes. So the challenge is twofold. Do we have enough export earnings to get enough dollars to pay these loans in the next 3-4 years? And the answer to that is probably not, due to two reasons. One is critical sectors such as tourism have been affected because of COVID-19. Foreign remittances have dropped over the past few months because of the pandemic as well. And our export markets such as the US and the EU countries are affected because of the situation, which means that export earnings overall are likely to see a drop over the next couple of years. So then the next option is going to be in going to foreign capital markets, or like we have discussed, an IMF or bilateral loans in order to pay these. So then the question is how we manage that capacity, because if we try to for example manage the currency by using up our reserves, that adds more pressure on our reserves and our ability to pay the debt. So I think overall the government has a dual challenge in managing the debt situation whilst managing, as we have already discussed, the politics of it, because if there is no economic growth, if there is no relief for the people who have been affected by the current situation, then that's going to have a political cost as well.
But when it comes to our peers, like let's talk about Bangladesh for an example, they have 34% to pay. 39% by Philippines, 42% by Thailand, 55.6% by Malaysia and Vietnam, and then 68% by our close neighbor India. That is the debt ratio significantly higher than our peers when it comes to where we stand at present, because when it comes to monetary terms, rupee terms, we owe 13 trillion, that is 86.8% compared to India at 68%, 34% by Bangladesh to be the lowest. Do you think that we can do something in terms of paying off this debt in the right span of time, and that makes Sri Lanka a vulnerable nation in the eyes of the international community?
I think that's partly the conversation that we've been having right now, and that's partly why the ratings agencies are making the sort of decisions that they are. At the same time, like I said earlier, there is the positive is that the domestic economy has kick-started much earlier, but I think overall we need to assess as to how we can pay off these loans by managing our reserves as well as attracting enough export.
I just want to quickly move to Dr. Sarath Rajapatrina. Dr. Rajapatrina, interestingly, the government debt relative to revenue has gone up by 686% in 2019. Yeah. Now that number stands at 2019. In 2016, the number stood at 560%.
Yes.
So within a span of 4 years, remarkably, the number has increased.
It's true, correct, that's correct.
What is the reason? Bad management?
No, our revenue is not increasing, that's the point. Debt is increasing, but the revenue is not increasing at the same time. So that
Do you think that the Ministry of Finance then made the wrong choices?
Well, a lot of people have made wrong choices.
You can look at Daniel for that, Dr. Rajapatrina.
I don't want to blame Daniel.
Because Daniel was the former advisor to the Ministry of Finance. So if you want to say something to him now, this is the ideal opportunity. Did he manage it wrong? Did his minister manage the country's economy wrong?
No, I take your question much more seriously than you are doing now.
Yeah. Tell me.
We should learn from our experience, right? That if we continue to do the same act over and over again, and ask the IM to bail us out, there's one point where this...
Because the danger is, Dr. Rajapatrina, taking seriously to note what you're saying right now, the danger is Thailand stands at 197% and India, being our closest neighbor, stands at the highest of 344%.
Yeah.
And Sri Lanka, the number stands at 686%.
Yeah, probably among the three countries that have the highest this ratio of, that is the simple explanation is that we continue to borrow, right? We continue to borrow and we continue not to invest in areas that gave us return that was transferable to foreign exchange because they are not in tradable goods. And our revenue was, at one stage it was 8% of GDP, among the lowest in the world. And we continued without any, without great concern about it. One day, the day will come,
What would be the debt to GDP ratio? What is the best case scenario for Sri Lanka?
Actually, we don't know that. Currently it's 87%, right? Debt to GDP ratio does not tell you very much. The other ratio of what they have, revenue to debt payment is a better indicator. Because actually, in a way, debt has a profile. I mean, nobody asks you to pay the whole amount on Monday morning. So it has a sort of structure that we have borrowed short term, we have borrowed at commercial rates after we work. So we have made a lot of, we have created for us a lot of problems that we have to, the payday is coming. And I think that we have to, as I go back to my earlier comment, while we are dealing with the debt problem, going to the IMF, if people have difficulty with IMF, I would only say, we would do the same thing what they would be doing if it were left to us. If we were asked to go and do a program to get us out into this, we will all agree. There won't
So
be
Daniel, in all seriousness to what Dr. Rajapatran said about the experiences, you have to learn from your mistakes, but I don't want to get over that mistake, because at the end of the day they say if yesterday was a battle, today is a challenge, tomorrow would be an incredible experience. So you have to reflect on the past as well. Where did the previous government go wrong?
So before I go answer that question, I'll just give a quick overview of the revenue side at the Ministry of Finance over the past 5 years. I was there for the last 6 months, but I think I agree with the policy that took place over the last 3 years of that 5-year period. And in 2017, Sri Lanka ran a primary surplus. That means government revenue was higher than government expenditure, excluding interest, for the first time since the mid-50s. So basically for the first time in proper post-independence Sri Lankan history. Why the debt to GDP ratio increased over that period is primarily a result of the currency depreciating. Because half of our debt is in foreign currency, every time the currency depreciates, our debt to GDP ratio increases. The primary cause for that currency depreciation was the events in October and November 2018. That's basically when the debt to GDP ratio really shot up. As for where
28 in October, is that the 52-day government?
Precisely.
Okay.
There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a rating downgrade. Markets went a bit berserk.
April 21st attacks did not bring...
They also affected the currency as well.
So we have to speak on both sides.
Yes, of course.
Okay. Yeah.
So in terms of your question on where the previous government went wrong and where it went right, so I think it went right in terms of attacking the numerator, ensuring that there was a primary surplus for the first time in whatever 50, 60 years. Where I think the issue was in the structural reforms that would unlock growth. There, if we look at 78, we saw a liberalization of the economy, reduction in tariffs, we saw privatizations, we saw basically a modern open economy that was embracing the world, that was embracing trade. What we saw between 2015 and 2020 was kind of muddling along. What we've seen this year is the economy closing again, going back to the 70s, and that's what I'm very concerned about.
Dr. Dunu Singha, you heard the coin of both sides now, at least two sides. One, Dr. Rajapatran is speaking about learning from my experiences, and then Daniel speaking about what really went wrong as far as the economy was concerned. At that time, that was currency depreciation. What is your opinion as an independent observer of the country's economy?
I think, as Dr. Rajapatran mentioned, that learning from past is very much relevant in today's context. If you look at some of the policies that have been introduced in recent, say, month, in particular going back to this what you call sort of restricting imports and focusing more on local economy. I think this policy has been experimented by Sri Lanka several times, and now it is time to learn, or time to learn means actually not time to learn, but really time to act. That certainly we agree that there are certain things that we can do domestically, but we have to really figure out what those activities are, and we have to what we call trust international trade, export and import. I think you cannot just restrict imports and love export, promote export. I think that this policy strategy we need to clearly understand. And when it comes to Mr. Daniel position, I think what went wrong is, to my understanding, is failed to maintain the political sustainability of economic policy. Economic policy became politically unsustainable. I think this is not the first time that the UNP government experienced this. Even in early 2000, the same thing experienced. Now, whenever you do policy reforms in a democratic setup, you need to be very much careful in. It does not mean that you cater to the what the people just request, like giving handouts or something similar to that, but you have to communicate properly the reforms or the the policies that you plan to introduce, and win people to the economic policy that you trust will serve the country in the medium to long run. In that
do you think
context, I think
that's what is happening now, that there is a clear economic policy that the people have faith in, that investors have faith in?
no, I don't think so. I don't think that maybe people may like, but it lead to a failure. That
When
is
you-
very clear, I think.
Actually, Kitma, oppose, when you look at, I mean, there seems to be a sense of inevitability that we will have to take that money from the IMF. I mean, the application has already been made. But when you look at those personalities within the government that are detractors of the IMF, and they're saying, we don't want anything from the IMF because it's conspiracy and they have too many conditions, we don't want to abide by their conditions. Are we really in a position that we can sort of, I mean, you spoke about how the domestic economy has kick-started early and that has helped us out economically. But in the, not even the long run, but in the short midterm, do you see any possibility where, or do you concur with those economic pundits who do not agree with you that that this can be done without an IMF bailout?
Well,
Do you see any possibilities?
Well, there are possibilities of getting money without an IMF bailout, and that comes from bilateral loans. But those bilateral loans come with conditions as well. They can come with soft conditions, they can come with hard conditions, but what it won't come with will be responses to structural reforms, policy reforms. But those conditions will become elsewhere, in particular in terms of...
And those conditions won't be transparent, as the public won't know what those conditions are.
Whereas I would say at the point at which we get the money that we need and also initiate the structural reforms that the economy has been craving for, and that is, I think, the consensus across the bench here, that in the long run brings benefits to the economy, it brings benefits to the country and brings benefits to the government as well, because a sustained period of economic stability and growth for the government is politically beneficial as well. Of course, that comes at the cost of maybe some short-term costs, but I think as we've seen right now, there is, relatively speaking, political stability with the current government. So they have a little bit more political capital that they can use to initiate the reforms if they wanted to.
When you look at the language in which when we speak of the Sri Lankan economy, I mean, we always, as Shamir said at the beginning of the show, we speak of resilience, but two other words, a phrase that is also constantly thrown around is structural weaknesses. And I think in pretty much every business publication in the country, you constantly come across this word, structural weaknesses with the Sri Lankan economy. We have no way of boosting revenue, we have no way of like cutting down on our expenditure. What are these structural weaknesses that need to be addressed?
Most fundamentally, getting enough money to spend on government spending, to spend on what the government wants to invest in. So that can come in the form of education and healthcare or infrastructure, but at the point at which we don't have money to invest, then we go for loans. And like I said, like in my first intervention, we have done that since independence. The problem right now is that as a middle income country, we no longer have access to concessional loans and therefore have to borrow from international markets, paying interest rates at 3 to 7%. So that is what's adding up these costs over the years.
So you think it's more of a revenue issue or an expenditure issue?
Both. So one is we need to increase revenue and have enough money in our bank. But secondly, where we spend that money. So given that we have a small pot of money, then we need to be smart as to where we invest that. Are we going to invest that in projects that bring revenue to the government in the long run, education, healthcare and so on? Or are we going to invest it in, certain projects that don't incur any sort of revenue in the long run and in fact overburden the economy's debt.
Kipina, my question to you would be about your opening statement. You spoke about debt-led development, and at present the Sri Lankan economy, or Sri Lanka as a whole, is in a precarious position in the eyes of the international community. And let's talk about debt and Sri Lanka's geopolitical placement, so to speak. We know that over the past few years debt has been mounting, and one of the prime examples is the Hambantota port, which was leased to China for 99 years in return of 1.1 billion, if I'm not mistaken, US dollars. Do you think that the lenders or the big fish in the world, USA, China, India, are handing out loans to Sri Lanka with their own interests at hand, with a hidden intention? How does the government navigate through these waters and ensure that Sri Lanka's national interests are protected while obtaining debt and developing the country?
Okay,
I'll come back to you in a minute. I'll let Kipina answer it, and then I'll come back to you.
Sure. So let me start off by saying that I think the phrase that Sri Lanka is in a debt trap to China is over exaggerated. If you look at our debt structure, our bilateral debt to China in terms of our total bilateral is about 14%, which is the same as ours to India. But you don't see the New York Times article about how we are in a debt trap to India. You know, there's a political aspect to this. So yes, debt to China is a contributory factor overall, but it's not exclusively about debt to China. So I think we need to kind of recognize that aspect.
Dr. Rajapathiran, yes, you all.
Yeah, I want to make one correction because these are often repeated. That we did not sign a 99-year agreement. We had provisions like this at the beginning. That is, we can buy back part of the thing. It can go down to at least 30-40% over time. Number one. So it's two companies basically. Our company created by us, company created by them. They can, over time, we can buy back what they have leased from us. They have leased from us. Yes. It's a lease. It's much better than earlier system of just giving 99 years carte blanche. This is not a case like that. Number one. Number two, most importantly, anybody can invest in that area. Anybody can have a factory there. It can be Americans, it can be Russians, it can be Czechoslovakian, whoever they are. So those provisions are there. But people keep on talking about 99 years and only Chinese. No.
Yeah, Dr. Dunu Singh also wants to add something.
Yeah, I think because this about the Chinese debt trap, I think I also would like to comment. First thing is that actually when you discuss whether China is the one who is responsible for the current debt trap that Sri Lanka pays, people tend to look at the foreign loan share of different donors. Okay, China accounts for say 10%, Japan accounts for say 11% or 12%, ADB 14%, like that. But I don't think that simple explanation is sufficient. If you look at the loan in terms of concessionality, in terms of project cost, in terms of economic impact, I think it will be very clear. Even the procurement method applied, I think it is high time that to a greater extent I can say that Chinese loans are responsible for the current debt crisis. I don't say that entirely, that I have to qualify that it is not that the main responsibility fall with the China, but certainly the main culprit is the what we call the financial market borrowing that we have initiated from 2007, but Chinese debt also add to the current burden.
So do you condone that there is actually a debt trap, so to speak?
I cannot say debt trap, but I say debt burden, because you have to, when you analyze, you have to look at the concessionality, procurement method, project cost and economic impact.
Dr. Rajapathiran, interestingly, we all talk about debt to GDP ratio. This is a commonly used phrase, and This is how usually we measure the debt ratio of a country. However, I was listening to Professor Ricardo Hausman from the Harvard University speaking at the deep dive session organized by the Advocata Institute, and he says that the best way to look at the country's economy's debt ratio is to look at the interest burden to tax revenue. Now this is quite interesting, because if you take a look at Japan as he speaks, he says Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of 230% and it all contracted at zero interest rate. And whereas Sri Lanka, if you take a look, the debt to GDP ratio is 86% and there is a 7% interest rate. Now this is interesting, isn't it?
Very interesting, and he's right. I mean, I don't think he's right about zero. And actually, when somebody writing about it, I said, don't put zero. I mean, we don't know where it is. We know that their interest rates are very low in Japan. That doesn't really cram their style. They are saving 40%
no,
of
but
their
the overall thinking of this statement, saying that look at the interest burden to tax revenue as opposed to the commonly cited debt to GDP ratio is quite interesting, isn't it?
Very good, very correct. I think the thing is that don't put a lot of burden on the debt to GDP ratio, because it's not very good anyway. Because as I said, you are not asked to pay that debt on a Monday morning. It has a structure to it. There are different terms and all that. So, but what he suggested, I think a lot of countries now look at it. What he suggested, look at the amount of debt divided by the amount of the revenue that you can generate.
So Daniel, I want to drag your attention to a statement that was made by Dr. Priyanka Dunusingha about the UNP not having clear-cut policies as far as the country's economy is concerned, and most of the political decisions that have been taken are based on instability. He did not mention Ranil Wickremesinghe, but he said the eras were 2000, where Ranil Wickremesinghe was the Prime Minister then, and 2016-2019 period, again where Ranil Wickremesinghe was the Prime Minister. What is the reason behind this? Mismanagement again?
So when you say instability, I think you're referring to Dr. Gunasinghe's comment that there was an issue of a political compact for the economic reform program at the time. As for the 2002-2004 period, I'm not able to comment. I wasn't around at the time. As for the more recently, I think there was the difficulty of a coalition government that significantly impacted the ability for the government to A, carry out a reform program, and B, speak with one voice in terms of communicating a reform program. So I think that was certainly a challenge for the government. As to whether they could have done more in terms of communication or less, I don't really know.
So let's talk a little bit about the budget now. November 17th. It's going to be a crucial day for this government, as the first reading of the budget is going to happen. I'm not yet sure whether it's going to be Mahinda Rajapaksa in his capacity as the Minister of Finance, or Ajit Nimad Kabra in his capacity as a State Minister of Finance, who will be making the submissions to Parliament this time around. However, you have seen Ajit Nimad Kabra being very vocal about the country's economy. So any guesses as far as the 17th November budget is concerned? We'll start off with Dr. Rajapatrina. What are the expectations?
I think that they have to deal with the current situation, right? So in the sense that, look at the revenue side, they have to have some measures. For example, there's a very easy thing to do. Turn back the tax breaks that were given when they came into power, reducing VAT from 15 to 8%. That was undertaken before COVID-19. So they were quite innocent. They didn't know what this was going to happen. Nobody knew, right? So they can say, look, we made the decision without knowing that COVID was going to come. So let's go back and say, have the same VAT rate as we had before. Number one, easiest thing to do. Second thing is that there are, look at the opportunities to increase indirect taxes. Our indirect taxes are 80% of our total taxes, 20% direct taxes, right? So we have a chance to increase more the direct taxes, whichever means you want to take, This idea of improving revenue have been around for a long time. I mean, governments come and say we are going to, and they don't do it. They came close to doing it in the last government when a very good study was done by some very good finance experts. I had met them, and McKinsey's people and also came and helped, but it was not implemented. What the last government had at the beginning good program, but never implemented them. They had, for example, I can remember that November 5th article that Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe wrote in 2016. Excellent program. I mean, you know.
No, but we've seen such programs predominant in the past as well.
Yeah.
We saw how Mahinda Rajapaksa regime said that by 2016 Sri Lanka would be made a 4-hub country, where it would be an industrial hub, where it would be a technological hub, where it would be the miracle of Asia. That was the topic that was discussed.
Yeah.
And then 2016 they were talking about a 2040 vision.
Yeah.
And I think the government was way too quick to decide that, and they wouldn't have thought that they would not be in power in a span of 4 years subsequently. So we've seen these statements being made predominantly by politicians, by respective governments. Unfortunately, people have had to face the brunt of it, isn't it?
Actually the talk has been always far ahead of what actually action was, and the last government also did not do what it said it was going to do.
So we're talking about expectations of the budget, Kitmin. Now, interestingly, the government is saying that they got a mandate from the people as far as their manifesto is concerned to bring in the 20th Amendment to the Constitution. So the government is now cherry picking. They've forgotten the fact that they also said that they would give free fertilizer to all in the farming community in the country as well. That was also one of the election promises. Do you think the government will have that magic wand in their hand and give the subsidies required for the people in the 2021 budget?
Well, I think the government has some additional leeway from the public because of the current pandemic. Because I think the public will also be more sympathetic if the government doesn't give the sort of handouts they promised earlier because of the situation. So maybe fertilizer subsidy might not be the way to go, particularly given that the government has already implemented the sort of import restrictions in the agricultural sector, which is helping, or at least the domestic agriculture sector sees as beneficial to them. So I think the pandemic gives a little bit more political cover for the government not to spend as much as they would have in another political cycle. And like we've discussed, I think the fact that there is this issue of debt overhang, I think brings a form of realism to what the government can and cannot do. So even though the government might want to spend a lot, I think fiscal discipline...
But that won't hold ground, Kitmin, because when it comes to rural masses of Sri Lanka, they want handouts, they want concessions, they want to feel good after a budget is announced. That's how the rural masses have got used to listen to budget speech and then saying, guess what, okay, this sector is being benefited, this sector is being benefited. At the end of the day, there's going to be money inside my pocket. However, you are speaking mainly to the urban areas of the country.
Not really, because I think the difference is that this budget is not preceding an election, and that gives the government a lot more leeway in terms of what they can do. Whereas I think previously we've seen either parliamentary elections or provincial elections following right after a budget, and that is why governments tend to kind of do the things that they have in the past. So the fact that this budget is not preceding the election, and given the fact that we are also dealing with a pandemic situation, I think there will be certain handouts given, undoubtedly. However, the extent of those handouts, I think, well, hopefully will be much more limited, because fiscal discipline will be important for economic sustenance and growth.
Dr. Priyanka, when you take a look at import restrictions as well as controlled prices being introduced by the government, example, we saw in February last year, just before the COVID-19 pandemic really took away in Sri Lanka, we saw a statement being made by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa saying that canned fish as well as dal would have controlled prices, and now we have the story of our lives, going to the vendor with a measuring tape to measure coconuts. So we have a control mechanism there as well. Is this what the people want?
Yeah,
Or is this healthy for a government?
Yeah, I think I come to that answer that question after just replying, not replying, but maybe contributing to some of the.
Or having a difference of opinion against Kitmina?
No. Basically, I think for 2021 budget, I don't recommend any sort of tax increase as such or expenditure cut. The reason is that with the pandemic, I think that Sri Lanka has faced a kind of a supply shock and the demand shock at the same time. So further tax increase will have whatever it is, to my understanding, some sort of negative impact on the economy. I think in this context, it is very important that government look at what are the, in particular, international assistance that government can tap in a context even to favorably look at the MCC is something that I think realistically government should look at, and to look for other financial arrangement in particular bilateral sources. I think it is high time that inject some amount of money to the economy to activate the economic activities. It is like that a patient who's inside the blood is not produced.
The government can't even pay its debt. Now that's what we are discussing right now. And then doctor, you are saying that the government has to inject money on the country's economy. Where is the government going to find that rabbit from the hat?
I think that is the challenge the government is facing.
But that's very impractical.
No, I think there are rooms where that
Print
government.
money?
No, I am sure that government can talk to the traditional bilateral and multilateral lenders, and there are proposed programs that they are willing to even finance. At the moment, some of the programs, as I know, that on hold. Okay, I don't think that there is any sort of what we call limit to such financial assistance as such. But what is needed is, I don't recommend that government should stop borrowing. Government has to borrow. Government must utilize it productively. Okay, there is no way out, other way around. What you call save money for repaying. I don't think that is possible.
Very quickly, doctor, because I want to give Zenith an opportunity to pose questions to the panel as well. But very quickly, with regard to control prices, going to the vendor with a measuring tape, are these decisions quite prudent for a government to think about as far as the economy is concerned, bringing in control prices?
No, I think it is no, and government policymakers also, it doesn't work. They also know that those simply don't work, but just to say that we have taken measures to communicate that every government does this. I think this is very clear.
Dr. Dunasika, did you go to the vendor with a measuring tape yet to buy coconuts?
No, I haven't gone, but I think it is very clear. No, those are not practical, but simply just place it.
You can pose questions from the panel.
Speaking of import restrictions, Kitmina, how justifiable are the import restrictions that were imposed in April, that is to defend the currency depreciation? Don't you think that these import restrictions lead to black markets?
So in terms of certain restrictions like non-essential goods like motor vehicles, I think there's some justifiability that the government can make, because there is a massive pressure on the currency that had to be managed. I think the bigger issue is in regards to the broader import restrictions that have been implemented, because it affects the small and medium enterprises most, and because, like it or not, we can talk about import substitution, but Sri Lanka is a small economy and we don't have the sort of natural resources that are required to make the sort of products that some of our SMEs produce. So that requires imports. And if you talk to the SMEs in particular right now, they will say that when they try and source from domestic markets, their cost increases by 3 to 4 times, right? So 300 to 400%. which again reduces their profitability and has a knock-on effect, right? So in terms of the certain non-essential products such as motor vehicles, I think there is some justifiability there. I think the issue, however, is A, how long can we implement these sort of import restrictions, because it is not feasible, and also secondly counterintuitive and counterproductive to the economy's competitiveness. And secondly, as we've discussed earlier, the fact that these intermediate goods and raw materials are taxed or restricted the way they are means that our export products are also affected, that our export competitiveness is also affected. So yes, some of the export raw materials have the exemption, but particularly the small manufacturers who are exporting based on more modern types of supply chains don't necessarily qualify for these sort of exemptions. So they have to go on a case-by-case basis to get exemptions, and that's a unfeasible means of doing business. So, like I said, there are always two sides to the coin, and in terms of justifiability, I think there is a certain aspect that can be justified, but I think feasibility, particularly in the longer run, is challenging.
Thank you, Kitman and Daniel. So, foreign direct investments are vital to Sri Lanka for economic development. So, against such a backdrop, we see many manufacturing facilities divesting from China. They are relocating to countries like Vietnam, Thailand, some are even considering India, some have already relocated to Mexico. Why not Sri Lanka?
So the challenge for a foreign investor is basically what's the best place to invest, and that's primarily an issue of cost. And that cost has multiple components. You have labor cost, you have the cost of your raw materials, you have the cost of putting up your factory and the fixed costs involved. On all these measures, Sri Lanka is generally not particularly competitive. So I'm sure Kitman will have a lot to add. He studied this extensively. But if you look at labor, for example, our labor costs adjusted for productivity are pretty high. Why is that? It's because we have a huge amount of labor that's employed inefficiently in the public sector and inefficiently in agriculture, and which is overseas. So that means that your local equilibrium market labor costs are higher than they would otherwise be, and that makes it more difficult for an investor to invest in Sri Lanka. If you look at the fixed cost of land and plant, there again, the cost of building things in Sri Lanka is very, very expensive, significantly because of import tariffs. The steel, I think, has a Dr. Rajapatrana, is it 80% or 60%?
Yeah, something like that.
Tariff on steel. Cement, there's a significant tariff. All these items make it very expensive to build in Sri Lanka. Then, if we look at raw materials, there's extensive import controls on raw materials as well. We saw that in the poultry industry recently. The inability to import maize meant that our exports in poultry have been affected. So these are many of the reasons why the government has been trying to do some things in terms of resolving some of the land issues with industrial zones. There's been some talk of para-tariff reductions as well, but the proof is in the pudding on those. But so I think those are the key priorities in terms of FDI.
Are these the structural weaknesses that you were referring to before?
I think in addition to what Daniel just said, the big thing I would say is policy stability. And I think Sri Lanka is notorious for policy instability and changing policies, tax policy in particular. I think at one point there were 2.5 budgets, as I call them, in 1 year. So those sort of policy changes are a disincentive for foreign investors. So what we see right now, Zinat, in Sri Lanka is that we get a lot of foreign investment that is incentive seeking. So they'll come for the tax incentives that the government gives. They'll stay for about 10 years, pack up and leave. But what we are lacking is efficiency seeking investment, foreign investment. And those sort of foreign investors are what will create more export revenue, what will create more employment in the economy, and what will create more competitiveness in the economy overall. So the Vietnams, the Malaysias have grown because of efficiency seeking investment. But they are not coming in partly because of the cost issue that Daniel spoke about, but I would say more than that is policy instability, and the fact that policies change all the time. It's not just about governments changing, it's within the same government. Policies change within a matter of months.
Kitmina, so Sri Lanka is currently ranked 99th in the ease of doing business index. So recently the government announced plans to bring Sri Lanka to reach the 25th position by 2025. So given these structural weaknesses and the policy instabilities, tax reform, problems relating to tax, do you think that we could achieve this objective by 2025?
Well, the short answer is if we don't address the structural weaknesses and the reforms, we won't. So if we want to get to the 25th position, the government will have to address those. I mean, I must caveat that the ease of doing business index in itself is, there is some controversy about how much it is applicable. However, the point of the fact of the matter is, regardless of how much you quarrel about its efficacy, certain foreign investors look at it as a signaling function, and it is good PR as well to say now we are 25th. So overall it helps certain governments, particularly developing governments, to leverage themselves as a destination, but like to answer your question, if we don't enact the sort of reforms that are needed, no, we're not going to move up.
If I can just add to the policy stability argument, I completely agree with what Kitmina is saying. And I think in the short, medium run, one way of locking in some policy stability is FTAs, because that really it's a bilateral treaty that means that you can't change things so easily, and that's been a critical way in which a number of countries across the world have really developed. If you look at East Asia, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, free trade agreements have been central to the export and therefore growth strategies as well. And that's something where Sri Lanka was an early mover in South Asia, but we've really lagged behind, and we're no longer in the FTA party really.
Can I go back to, this is a very important area that you have. Actually, most of the East Asian economies started growing in the mid-60s when they followed good policies, starting with Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea and Taiwan, the four tigers, so to speak. But actually they did not grow because of FTA. I would say you would grow despite the FTA, because FTAs first of all carries this myth, free trade area. There is no free trade there. I'll tell you, when I saw Latin America in the 1990s, I was working on Latin America, and I talked to people who were dealing with the agreement between Mexico and United States. And one of the people who came to the discussion said, free trade is 2 words, but the Americans want 2,000 pages in the free trade agreement about triple transformation, how goods have to be changed in what type of domestic value added is needed. So I really don't think that FTAs were so helpful in creating everything. Even our FTAs, why not go to unilateral trade reform?
I'm not disagreeing. I think
Yeah.
unilateral trade reform.
Yeah.
But the problem which Kitmina highlighted was the fact that unilateral reform can be very easily reversed in a way that an FTA can't. An FTA is entrenched.
I'm not sure about it. I don't think the binding with another country is as forceful as binding with the world trade rules. So that is the difference.
I think the other problem is that Sri Lankans have found, or Sri Lankan governments have found ways to undermine the FTAs.
Yeah.
So even though we bind ourselves to certain policies through FTAs, we found, novel tools such as para-tariffs to, undermine those commitments. So I slightly disagree with you on that, Daniel, that, FTAs will secure policy stability.
Daniel, I just want to take your attention back to 2016. You were part of the delegation of Ranil Wickremesinghe going to India. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were with Minister Manga Samaravira at that time. There was discussion about EDCA at that time, and that too has still not been borne fruit. So FTAs is not the way to go, is it?
Sorry?
FTAs are not the way to go about, is it? Because we saw discussions taking place over and over again, EDCA not being brought as a white paper where people could have discussed early and then come into an agreement. As a result of that, the GMOA criticized it. There were a lot of protests in the country. There were issues of expat workers coming to Sri Lanka as a result of that free trade agreement which came in. They dubbed it as SEPA before,
That's right.
CEPA coming in as EDCA. So you were part of the delegation before as well in 2016. Didn't work out in favor of the government at that time.
So the question of whether something is worked out as to, or whether it's a good thing, are two different questions. I think EDCA was, and SEPA before it, were both very important for Sri Lanka. They were very important primarily because it helped Sri Lanka go into Indian supply chains. And that would have made us just like a Poland to Germany, or a Korea to China, or something like that, where we are coupling ourselves to a larger economy, and we're able to specialize and go into those supply chains and then develop our export industries through that. That's been a story that's worked countless times. And the failure to do that is part of the reason why our growth is slow today, and why we're still stuck with only one manufacturing industry of any note, the garments industry, which we developed between 78 and the early 80s. We haven't moved on beyond that. And these free trade agreements would have helped.
Isn't that the
They're not a silver
inability?
bullet.
Isn't it the inability of the previous government?
I think it's the inability of successive governments. SEPA began negotiations when, 2002 or thereabout. So we're talking about it 18 years later, and there have been many governments that have come and gone. And
2002, when Ranil Wickremesinghe was the Prime Minister.
That's right, and then negotiations.
And then 2016, EDCA came in as a result of Ranil Wickremesinghe being the Prime Minister of the country as well.
Correct. So there have been consecutive governments, including in 2006 was the final round, I think, of SEPA, which then failed. But different governments.
So do you agree what Kitmina as well as Dr. Durusinghe says about policy instability of the previous government as well as respective governments have led Sri Lanka to this situation right now?
I think, yes, there has been policy instability amongst different governments. I don't think the previous government had, in fact, made improvements with respect to economic policy in terms of policy stability. The Inland Revenue Act is, I think, one premier example. It removed a significant degree of discretion from the Minister of Finance and placed it in Parliament and created a rules-based framework for taxation, and that significantly reduced policy instability, or would have if it wasn't amended again.
Dr. Durusinghe, can the people expect to save some money following the budget 2021? Or would the spending power be more, the cost of living will be high, and as Kitmina said, the people would give in a bit of leeway for the government and say, guess what, COVID-19 has struck, so we will give some cushioning for the government. We will tighten our belts as we did in 2009 when the war took place in the country.
Yeah, basically the budget determined out of the total GDP how much a individual must spend and how much government is ready to spend. So in that sense, actually it is about sharing the country's GDP. But to my understanding or my predictions, shall we say, I don't think that government will go for significant changes into the existing tax regimes, and also will provide sizable handout as such. In that context, what we can expect is to continue in terms of taxes and the welfare of the subsidy schemes as the way that we right now continue.
Now the central bank predicts a 1.5% growth for Sri Lanka by the end of 2020, whereas the ADB says minus 5%, and then whereas the World Bank says minus figures. But the government is very optimistic about hitting the 1.5% mark. Optimistic thinking or wishful thinking?
I cannot give a name as such, but I think maybe I also recently saw that I think the Kitmino also related that government has basically highlighted how the domestic, some of the production sectors have recovered after the pandemic or the lockdown period, but it does not say that we will be the Sri Lanka will record a positive growth as such.
But you don't think?
I don't think. I think the possibility is high now. Even if you take the current, emergence, possibility is high that the economy will contract. I think that is reasonable to expect. I don't think that. I think in the South Asia, Bangladesh is expected to record a positive growth. Bangladesh, Nepal, I think, and Bhutan, I think. All other countries, it is expected to record a negative growth rate. So I don't think that the current government prediction is,
What about the IPS now? IPS has an annual report that comes in, but this time it's quite late. I think it's because of COVID-19.
Yes, and it's coming out in 2 weeks. So shout out to whoever.
What is the prediction of the IPS?
So IPS doesn't do predictions. We don't forecast growth. What I think is reasonable to assess is that the 1.5 growth projection was made at the beginning of the year, when it wasn't necessarily clear as to how much the impact of the pandemic would be, particularly with the border closure and the impact on the tourism sector. And I think that is something that was obviously could not be predicted properly at the time. And I think right now we are seeing that I think first quarter growth contracted by 1.6%, if I'm not mistaken. We are waiting on second quarter growth statistics. And I think if we look at the 2 quarters, and particularly that second quarter was when the economy almost stalled effectively, I think realistically we are likely to see a contraction of the economy. To what extent, I think, is going to be difficult to assess right now, particularly given the news yesterday and the possibility that we may have another shutdown.
Kitmina, has the government got its priorities right now? Daniel says it has not got its priorities right. But coming from an institute that somewhat talks about the country's economy in the past and in the last few months, do you think the government has got its priorities wrong?
I don't think it's our job to say whether the government has got its priorities right or wrong. Our job, and as economists, is to provide the information to the policymakers as to what would work well for the economy, and the public decides whether to vote in or vote out politicians as to how they want to use that.
But that takes 4.5 years now, Kitmina, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, so exactly. If the government has got its priorities wrong, then the people will speak.
People will speak in 4.5 years.
So it's not my job to kind of make that assessment.
So, yes, Dr. Sarath.
We have
Rajbhatran.
neglected a lot of reforms, over the years. After 1977, late November, we have a huge agenda if we are going to get growth going again. We have to address the trade regime. We have to address the regulatory system, which has been in member since 2003. We don't have a competition policy. We have to fix the bleeding in the economic from the state-owned enterprise sector. Without these things, none of this is going to get a growth rate high. I mean, if you can get a jump in the growth rate only if the government does something that encourages or gives the incentive to do those things. It does not. The last government did not, frankly. But it didn't. So it talked about reform but didn't do it, or what it did was quite limited. And so it's not going to fall like manna from heaven. Government has to be involved and take the
I remember Dr. Rajapathrana. I happened to interview Mr. Parskar-Lingam, one of the economic stalwarts of the UNP government at one point. And when I asked him what is wrong with this government, which was in power, this was 2 years after the UNP government took over as a coalition government, he said what the government should do is three things. First is implementation, second is implementation, and third is also implementation. Do you also?
I fully agree with him. I have a lot of respect for him, and he said this at the very beginning.
So I want to give an opportunity to Jayamal to pose some questions as well, and then I go for a break, and then it's the final round.
Sure. Dr. Rajapathan, if I may ask now, throughout the duration of this program, we've been speaking about governments and reforms, how successive governments have introduced different types of tax reforms and subsidies and whatnot. How do you steer economic policy clear of politics? Say, do you come a presidential election or a general election? One of the main promises would be sweeping tax concessions or subsidies or whatnot, without any regards for how the economy is doing at that point. How do we steer clear the economic policy from politics?
I don't think you can actually. More sophisticated countries that are in modern economies. If for example, if you tell a British before election they are going to get a huge package of, the man will go to lose because he knows it cannot be done. But unfortunately we have got into a culture of where the budget is where you give goodies to various people. We have to get rid of that. We have to have politicians who say, I'm not going to tell you this, that what I cannot do. I'll tell you what we can do, and who talk that type of language. We have to wait a little while to find people who would say that. So you can't separate politics from economics, as I see.
I completely agree that you can't divorce politics and economics. They go hand in hand. What I think we can do is make the people make better choices, and that is in terms of economic literacy. So I think economic literacy is a fundamental necessity for Sri Lanka through the educational curriculum. So starting from grade, 6 or 7 onwards, I think there needs to be an understanding of what macroeconomics is. So we should not wait until people are at A levels, and that to a small percentage of the student body, to understand what economics is. So economic literacy, I think, would insulate these extremes a little bit better. Having said that, even developed economies like the USA, the rule was, regardless of who comes into power, the Democrats or Republicans, things like free trade were common, that both parties.
And there was bipartisan policy.
Then you have Trump, who came and completely overhauled the entire system, right? So even at that point, even in so-called advanced economies with relatively high economic literacy, you have populism, you have politics and economics going hand in hand. So the best way to insulate, or at least try and insulate, is better economic literacy amongst the people, and I think that's something that needs to come through the educational reform.
Right. So Zeenath, I can give you an opportunity to pose questions. One question. Yeah.
Yes. So Daniel, you've been a part of the Ministry of Finance, so you have better insight when it comes to the practicality of the problems that Sri Lanka is facing. So every year they announce a forecast when it comes to the fiscal, how much of a budget deficit they're targeting, and then they promise certain targets, but unfortunately they don't achieve any of them. So from the ministry's point of view, what are the main problems that or the obstacles that you'll have to face when it comes to achieving these targets?
So I'm not the right person to ask this question because I was never part of a budget formation process. But I think the real challenge here is building a system within the government of accountability for these targets. And if you look at other countries, one way in which they do this is they have an independent agency that does the forecasting. So for example, in the UK, you have the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is an independent body of the government. So it's separate from the government of the day and independently prepares forecasts of revenue, expenditures, and so on and so forth. So I think having that check and balance is really important. One agency that sort of performed that function to a limited degree was the Committee on Public Finance in Parliament. So I think that's really important that those institutions are there, and they help make them a little bit more realistic and better forecasts as well through that process of accountability and debate.
So thank you very much, gentlemen. We go in for a short commercial break. When we come back, we give each speaker an opportunity to speak of the country's economy as well as the way forward for Sri Lanka. You'll get 3 minutes each for your closing remarks. We're going for a short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We are discussing today about the country's economy as well as budget 2021. Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We are in the final round. We start off the final round with Kitmin Hevage, research economist, Institute of Policy Studies, state of the country's economy and the way forward.
Right. I think the first and foremost, public health is going to be the main determining factor of the state of the economy for the next year. If we don't tackle this so-called second wave of COVID-19 cases, we are going to be in big trouble. And no matter what we talk about in terms of structural reforms and everything else will be put to a side if we don't get this right. So public health, I think, is the number one contributory factor that will determine. I think second, the debt overhang for the next 3 years is real. Regardless of which party would have been in power, they would have had to deal with this reality. And unlike in previous years, we are going to be dealing with that unprecedented time, an unprecedented amount of debt repayment over the next 3 years. Therefore, there are two aspects to this. One is getting our fiscal policy intact, so fiscal discipline and increasing our revenue, as well as rationalizing our spending, so making better decisions in terms of how we spend our money. The second thing is in regards to improving our foreign reserves, so export revenue and so on. If we don't do that, and if we don't address our debt overhang, we are going to have to make some hard choices. We may potentially go into a default, and that's an unfortunate situation, and hopefully we don't. However, if we don't address these fundamental structural issues, we will inevitably have to make, if we don't address these issues right now, we will have to make much more harmful or more painful reforms down the line if we end up defaulting on our debt. So it's a matter of choosing whether to make the small changes and facing some hurt right now so we can get some long-term benefit, or we just push the ball down the line and end up harming ourselves a lot more.
Kitmin, very quickly, because you spoke about going on the red, not paying our debts. Let's take a look at Argentina for an example. In the early 1990s, they did not pay debt, and as a result of that, they filed for bankruptcy. But the country is doing okay.
The Argentinian people might not say that though. The problem is that because of Argentina's debt default, the access to capital, access to foreign capital has reduced significantly, which led to high levels of inflation, high levels, I think poverty rate was around 40% for a good 10-15 years after they defaulted. So I don't think they're doing okay there. They have had to, like I said, they've had to experience long-term pain to be okay right now 30 years down the line.
Right, thank you very much, Kitmin Hevage, research economist, Institute of Policy Studies. I'll come back to you, Dr. Rajapatrina, but I want to move to Daniel Alfonsus, a former advisor to the Ministry of Finance, way forward for Sri Lanka, and also the state of the country's economy. Your time starts now.
Yeah, so I think the consensus in this group at least has been that the government has fairly serious difficulties with repayment of debt. And the discussion is about an IMF bailout. The concern I have is that even that's not so easy. The IMF as a general rule, only lends to countries that are solvent but have liquidity problems. In Sri Lanka's case, there's very much a question mark as to whether we're solvent or not, which means that the ordinary IMF bailout, which we've had for 14 times in the last, 16 times in the last 40 plus years, is not going to apply or may not apply. What does that mean then? The IMF may include what they call private sector involvement. That is a euphemism for a default and restructuring of debt. So it's a different ball game now. Also, if we compare the situation between Sri Lanka and the IMF, the situation has changed today. The IMF has programs with dozens of countries around the world, including in Asia now, in a way that it didn't in the past. In other words, the IMF's resources are also extended in a way that they were not. So our bargaining position vis-a-vis the IMF has changed. With that in mind, I think ultimately, whether you have an IMF program, whether you do it yourself, it's going to be about three variables. It's going to be about revenue, it's going to be about expenditure, and it's going to be about growth. And I'm just going to touch on three policies which I think make sense under each one of these headings. On revenue, as Dr. Gunasinghe said, we need to take as many grants as possible and get them in to help reduce our debt to GDP ratio to drive growth. Second is we need to look at further leases. We've leased the South Asia gateway terminals in the Colombo port. We've leased the Colombo South Harbour. We've leased the Hambantota port. These are all generating tremendous amounts of economic activity. The Colombo port is one of the greatest ports in the world, one of the 30th largest ports in the world, primarily because of the private sector's involvement, other than the location as well, and the competition that has developed. Why not do that with the Jaya Container Terminal and the Unity Container Terminal as well? Why not do that in the longer term with the airports? Bring in that competition, make Sri Lanka the hub that it needs to be. So lease those things and look at privatization as well going forward to resolve some of the state-owned enterprise leakages that we've had. And third, in terms of revenue, is property taxation. Land prices in Colombo have increased by 300% over the last decade. Some of that value should be captured by the taxpayer and used to settle debt, used for relief measures at this time. So that's revenue. On the expenditure side, 80% of Sri Lankan government expenditure is recurrent expenditure. Of that, the vast majority is public sector salaries. If you look at the public sector today, it took 40 years for the public sector to double from 1968 to 2008. From 2008 to 2018, in 10 years it doubled again. What is the productivity we've got out of that? And then the question also relates to, we've used debt to put off really tough questions on the expenditure side. The war ended, but the defense budget, not only in absolute terms, but as a percentage of GDP has increased. We can't afford this anymore. So that's on the expenditure side. Finally, on growth, as I mentioned earlier, we have a choice. We have the choice that we made in 1977. Do we become a modern, open, industrial economy, or do we become inward, subsistence agriculture, and closed? That's the choice.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I now move my attention to Dr. Sarath Rajapatirana, Chair, Academic Program, Advocate Institute.
Yeah, all the good stories have been
stolen by two of them.
No, not stolen. Very well stated. Congratulations to both of my colleagues. So I'm going to look at there's going to be, whether we like it or not, a medium term in the world, and we'll be participating in it. That we are not still ready for it. That's the point. While we are dealing with COVID, while we are dealing with the debt thing, we have to think about growth. At the end of the day, that is what allows people to be deal with the question of poverty, unemployment, all those things depends upon. So it depends on three things that I was saying. And I am going to say, like Mr. Pascal Lingam saying about implementation, I say productivity, productivity, productivity. Our productivity is so low. For 30 years, we have been, our total factor productivity has been about hovering around 1.4 to 1.5%. Okay? Partly the economies have to be blamed because they have not made enough noises about it. So, for example, our average growth rate for all this period, 70 years, is close to 4.2%. That is with total productivity nearly hovering around 1.2%. If you ever double it, then our story would have been different. We won't be in this predicament. If you grow fast, if your growth rate is higher than the average interest rate that we pay, then we are going to we will never end up in a debt situation as we have done. So that is the first point. Second point is that, as Kitmini said, there is an opportunity. All the crises bring an opportunity also. If the crisis comes, the room for the government to do action that was not conceived before. For example, revise the VAT rate and say we go back to 15%. Actually, we protect already 11 goods, but mostly consumed by the poor people. So we keep it there, and then bring back the earlier tax reform that they had in mind. Third is that I think it is really silly, that's the right word, to ban imports the way that they have done. I agree with him on the motor cars, but others, you see the very simple idea. Whenever you increase a tariff, you make the domestic substitution much more profitable. Okay? Where do you think they get the resources to increase the production of the protected good? From exports and non-tradable goods. So even if there is not an intermediate good, you are going to hurt your exports by raising very high import duties and banning it. Banning is very silly. Banning is saying, the government saying, we don't want revenue. We are going to give the revenue to the private sector, somebody who wants to gouge the prices. So those are the things that I think we have to do.
No, but I just want to quickly ask you a question,
please.
Dr. Rajapathrana. The recent cabinet decision to stop the slaughter of cows in Sri Lanka, however, import meat from overseas. So this doesn't fall on that category, does it?
Yeah, I don't want to get into this. I have no idea what it was done. I have no idea. I don't see any justification. I really don't know.
You ducked that question very well, Dr. Rajapathrana. So I now move my attention to Dr. Priyanka Dinusingh, Senior Lecturer of Economics, University of Colombo.
Yes, I think most of the things already mentioned, so that I will focus only few areas. Number one is, I think it is very important at this moment to tap, and get the international cooperation. In that context, I will repeat again, government needs to really consider some of the proposed grant schemes such as MCC, as well as work with the other bilateral and multilateral donors. The second one is that why we export. I think we need to clearly understand why we export. When we export, we can actually charge higher prices for our product. That higher price allow us to pay higher wages, and that will lead to higher living standards. If you produce and just market at the local market or the say village market, the price that you can charge is very low compared to the when you sell it at nationally. And when you export, you can really charge a higher price. So that we need to understand that difference. I think if you want to improve living standards, actually we need to connect with the export, and we have to export more. The third one is, it is very important that we keep it in mind, right incentives will be given in an environment where we have inclusive institutions. Now if we go for extractive institutions where that powers get concentrated, economic growth is not sustainable. I think over and over this has been proven in the world history. So we need to really maintain and protect our inclusive institutions where the checks and balances will be there. So that is very important at this moment. The fourth one is that protectionism. I think Dr. Rajapathrana clearly mentioned that it is harmful. I think it is very basic economics. Simply you can understand we cannot do everything. I mean, that is where the economics, the economic activity starts. Specialization in areas where we can do better. So I think we need to adhere to such fundamental principles. Last, the public finance, I think government needs to take it very serious, and also it is very important that people also understand that even we like government may also like to, what we call impact all aspect of a human or the person's life, but it is not possible. Okay, in 70s, 60s, government could have impacted on all aspect of a person's life, but right now government has no ability. Government does not have that ability. Maybe because we have connected, whether government like or not, that ability is not there. That I think government needs to understand.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priyanga. So thank you very much, Daniel Alfonsus, former advisor to the Ministry of Finance, Dr. Priyanga Dimsingha, Senior Lecturer of Economics, University of Colombo, Dr. Sarat Rajapatirana, Chair, Academic Program, Advocata Institute, as well as Kitmin Hevage, Research Economist, Institute of Policy Studies, for joining us this evening on the show. It was a pleasure to have the four of you, and it was indeed nice to hear the thoughts that you brought to the table as far as the country's economy is concerned. Thank you very much, Nadeem. Thank you very much, Zeenat, as well as Jayamal, for joining us this evening on the show. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. There can be an economy only when there is efficiency, productivity, and implementation. Take care and goodbye.